All right. So it looks like things kind of steadied a bit. So we'll go ahead and jump into everything. So again, welcome everyone to our APIDA Heritage Month program. And so to kick things off, first I'll quickly introduce myself. So I'm Philip Seaborn, one of the assistant directors for undergraduate diversity in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And as is customary with all of our programs, we like to always start things off with a land acknowledgement. So we collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic indigenous communities in Michigan, for indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University in more accountable to the needs of the American Indian and indigenous peoples. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Kendra for our opening welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kendra Pyle. I use she, her pronouns. I am the DEI coordinator in the College of Natural Science, and we're very pleased to welcome you to this month's Amplify STEM event for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American APIDA Heritage Month. And these events are coordinated by the College of Agricultural and Natural Resources, the Lyman Briggs College, the College of Veterinary Medicine, and the College of Natural Science. These events amplify diverse voices and contributions within our community. We hope that each program is a learning opportunity to become more knowledgeable about issues that impact all of us. We're so pleased to be joined today by Dr. Naoko Wake for her presentation entitled Asian Americans in STEM, the Model Minority. And I will turn it over to Deanna for a little bit more information about APIDA Heritage Month.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying that Amplify STEM, again, is celebrating Asian Pacific Islander Desi American APIDA Heritage Month in April this year during our spring semester. However, it is nationally recognized in the month of May. Congress passed a joint congressional resolution in 1978 to commemorate Asian American Heritage Week during the first week of May. And this month was chosen because of two important anniversaries. The first, the arrival of the first Japanese immigrants in America on May 7th, 1843, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was done by many Chinese laborers on May 10th, 1869. In 1990, it was expanded from a week-long to a month-long celebration. APIDA Month celebrates the resilience, legacy, traditions, and cultures of the heterogeneous community that make up the APIDA population, which encompasses people from over 40 different nations, dozens of religions, and hundreds of languages. APIDA people have contributed significantly to American life, and yet many Americans are unaware of both their achievements and the marginalization they have experienced throughout history due to xenophobia and institutional and structural racism. As a community, we must continue to work to combat racism, gender-based violence, white supremacy, and other injustices that impact the APIDA community as a whole. APIDA Month celebrates the individual contributions that APIDA community members have made to our nation's culture and the arts, law, science, and technology, sports, and public service.
Thank you, Deanna. I have the honor now of introducing our guest speaker. My name is Danielle Flores Lopez, she, her pronouns. I serve in two roles in the College of Natural Science, the Interim Assistant Dean of DEI and the Director of Academic Advising and Student Success Initiatives. Dr. Naoki Wake, she, her, is a professor of history and the director of the Asian Pacific American Studies program at Michigan State University. A historian of gender, sexuality, illness, disability, and memory in the Pacific world, she has authored Private Practices, Harriet Stack Sullivan, The Science of Homosexuality and American Liberalism, and American Survivors, Trans-Pacific Memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She has created the largest oral history collection of Asian American survivors of the 1945 atomic bombings in the world, housed in MSU's Robert G. Vincent Vincent Voice Library and in the Densho Digital Repository. Her current project concerns the histories of disability, archives, and literature in Asian America. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, Association for Asian Studies, Oral History Association, Huntington Library, Center for the United States and Cold War at New York University, and Nagasaki National Peace Memorial Hall for the atomic bomb victims. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Naoko Waki.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to all the organizers for making this event today possible. And also everybody in the audience, I can't really see you. It's just the nature of a webinar, but I'm really happy that you chose to spend this lunchtime in the week of finals on Friday, no less, with us. So thank you for being here. So as Danielle mentioned, I am Professor Naoko Wake, and I teach, among other things, history of illness, health, and medicine. So when the request came my way that you all like me to talk about something that's related to APIDA Heritage Month, especially in a way that's interesting to people in STEM disciplines, I jumped on the occasion because that's something that I hold very dear to myself because of my research interest. So let me share with you my screen so that you can have a clear sense of where my talk today is going. So want to make sure that it happens accurately. Is this looking all right?
We are able to see it. We can't see presentation mode, but we can see all the slides.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
I think that's probably the way to go. If you don't mind, I'd actually like to have it in this mode so that I can have a sense of time that passes. So I say that this is a APIDA Heritage Month at MSU, and this is the context in which my talk today, Asian Americans in STEM, the model minority, is situated. And I'd like to, first of all, draw your attention to the difference between APIDA Heritage Month and the way I am calling my talk, Asian Americans. I don't say Asian American Heritage Month or APIDA people in STEM for reasons. So let me just quickly explain that. So APIDA Heritage Month is something that is actually very unique to MSU and somewhat more broadly to the America's Midwest. Nationally, it's more frequently referred to as a AAPI Heritage Month or more simply Asian American Heritage Month. But among scholars who study this subject, AAPI Heritage Month is more commonly used. And the reason for that is to show respect that there are different histories among Asian Americans in the US mainland and Pacific Islanders. Oftentimes, Asian Americans sort of associate with the image of East Asian Americans who are most numerous in the US mainland, and they have their own history of immigration to the United States. And on the other hand, Pacific Islanders have their own history that are in some ways similar to, but also distinct from the history of largely East Asian immigrants in the US mainland. So among scholars, it's very important to distinguish Asian American AA part from Pacific Islander part, PI part, and that's the reason why nationally it's often referred to as AAPI Heritage Month. The reason why in US Midwest and also especially in Michigan State, we refer to it as APIDA Heritage Month is because, first of all, our Pacific Islander population is extremely small, and it may not be surprising given our location in the US Midwest. So for that reason, it's very important for Pacific Islanders to have a very visible place, integrated place, when we refer to Heritage Months that celebrate all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And we do that for Desi Americans here for somewhat different reasons. That's where D comes in, which again doesn't have a particularly a strong place in the, or visible place in the national way of referring to AAPI Heritage Month. We do Desi Americans to refer to people who are from South Asian continent to make sure that they have their visibility in Midwestern context as well. Not necessarily because their number is as small as, say, Pacific Islanders, but because their presence is very strong and they do have very unique history to themselves as well. So for those reasons, we say it's APIDA Heritage Month here at Michigan State. And I know that Ohio State University use APIDA for probably the similar reasons. And I think University of Maryland also uses, just thinking about peer institution of ours, uses APIDA as well. In contrast, I call my talk Asian Americans in STEM because of the contemporary facts that in STEM disciplines, Asian Americans, especially East Asian Americans, are predominant. So, and my examples that I'm gonna refer to in today's talk are predominantly East Asian Americans. I think it's probably in today's talk exclusively that group. So I wanna make sure that I'm not trying to sound as if I am more comprehensive than my talk actually is in today's particular setting. So that's the reason why I say Asian Americans in STEM. So with that long introduction being done, let me just jump into the subject of our talk today. So I say the model minority as a way to think about Asian Americans in STEM. And the model minority, as you may be aware of, is a sort of historically constructed image of East Asian Americans as hardworking, but non-complaining, oftentimes subservient. They are quiet. They are kind of hard to read, but they work hard and they persevere. And as a result, they become successful. So I want us to, first of all, know where the idea that Asian Americans are a model minority, where they came from, historically speaking. And there are quite a few distinctively historical origins to this myth. Model minority idea is oftentimes referred to as myth because it's actually is not true, but there are some origins to the myth. And I'm going to tell you 3 origins that I like to highlight in my presentation today, starting with 1942 Executive Order 1966, issued by President Roosevelt on February 19th of 1942, just a few months after the Japanese Imperial Army attacked the Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And I like to emphasize here how Japanese Americans responded. So first of all, this instruction to all persons of Japanese ancestry, this is an order that was posted on the street. So that means that executive order was rather a surprising event for many Japanese Americans on the West Coast, largely in California. 2/3 of them, by the way, are US-born US citizens. Despite the fact that they were entitled to American citizenship rights and civil rights that came with it, they were incarcerated without due reason and without due cause. And that's something that happened again a few months after the Japanese Empire's attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941. And the picture in the middle, you see families, including young children and infants who were waiting for the train to come to pick them up. There are more than 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants, first generation immigrants, who were non-American citizens because they were born in Japan and at one point in their lives came to the United States. However, I like to emphasize that they were not entitled to be naturalized and become American citizens because of the discriminatory law that defined Asian immigrants, first-generation immigrants in this time period as ineligible for US citizenship. So this picture in the middle includes both citizens and non-citizens, including people who were in the US for a long time, 20 years, 30 years, and built their lives here, only to find out by that they were not entitled to become a citizen. I like to draw attention to how this young boy or maybe young man, I don't know the age of this particular individual, standing on the left side of this middle image. I hope you can see that there is a tag hang on his pants. And then those are tags that were given by the US government to be affixed on every and each Japanese Americans and Japanese people who were on their way to be incarcerated, to make sure their identity is clear. So it kind of gives you a sense of how those individuals are being treated by the United States government during the wartime. Many of them, a vast majority of people who are incarcerated are very obedient, kind of feeding into the model minority myth. Even though I like to note that there are many cases where Japanese Americans resisted the order by the US government because they thought that it was unjust and it's a violation of their rights as citizens. But the majority of them complied with 9066, kind of contributing to the image that Asian Americans are obedient and they don't complain about the authorities' decisions that were made about themselves. And to your right side, you see 442nd Regiment, a combat team that was exclusively consisted of Japanese American, young second generation Japanese American citizens. And in combination with the 100 Regiment that was actually exclusively made up of Japanese Americans from Hawaii, 442nd Regiment combat team is known as the most decorated team that fought World War II as part of the US Army that suffered the highest rate of injury and death. So it again kind of feeds into the myth that they, despite the fact that their rights as US citizens are being violated, remain loyal to America, and they fought hard to protect democracy, which was actually very much compromised the fact that they themselves and their family members were incarcerated without due process or due cause. And by the way, it took American historians almost 40 years to find out that there was actually no necessity that was legitimately evidenced, substantiated as evidence, that should have necessitated the incarceration of Japanese Americans, 1942 and onward. So this is the first origin of the Asian Americans as model minority myth that I mentioned earlier. First forward, in 1965, Hart-Celler Act, which actually overhauled US immigration system, is the second historical origin I like to highlight today. So this Hart-Celler Act, 1965 Immigration Act, is actually well known among immigration historians because for the first time in American history, of modern history of immigration regulation, the act abolished national origin quota and applied a system of preferences for family reunification, employment, and refugees. And the important fact here is that, well, national origin quota was pretty much a standard feature of US immigration history before 1965, in that if you come from Asian countries, the number of people who can come from your country and as new immigrants to the United States was limited up to somewhere around 100 per year. So it was very, very small, which again shows how America was, through their immigration laws and regulations, trying to keep America white and non-diverse up to this point in history. But after that, 1965, employment, especially employment category that accounted for the 20% of new immigrants to the United States, because it gave preference to professionals with specialized knowledge, including STEM knowledge, started to almost unintentionally, almost surprisingly, give greater number of immigrants from Asia a gateway to the United States workforce. And to your right, you see 1960s to 2013 change over time in terms of the origin of the new immigrants entering United States in each decade. So you can see green reducing over time strikingly. They represent European immigrants, and both blue and purple increasingly going up in their proportion and also absolute number. Purple parts represent Asian immigrants, and blue part represent immigrants from Americas, especially from South America. And you can see how once you have many people coming in the United States as new immigrants to pursue employment, especially employment in STEM areas, how this would also contribute to the family unification immigration, right? Because once you are here, you have ability to maybe bring your parents, maybe bring even your spouse from your home country, which would make them actually easier to become new immigrants to the United States, because family unification is giving preference after 1965. So as of 1965, more than 90% of Americans at that point in history, obviously predominantly white Americans, were very much in support of immigration regulation change in 1965, without knowing that in the long term, there will be much more diversity that will be brought to American population as a result of 1965 Hart-Celler Act. So that was a kind of a unintended consequence that really gave a boost to a number of Asian American immigrants. And by the way, as of 2022, last year, Asians are the fastest growing immigrants in the United States. And of course, Asian Americans, some of you who are in the audience, I hope, you are in a group of people who are fast growing group of immigrants in the United States today, because of this historical dynamism that really changed the profile of people who are coming to the US after 1965. And thirdly, and lastly, I like to point out 1966 New York Times article written by William Peterson entitled Japanese Americans, a Model Minority. And even though the model minority myth existed before 1966, as we saw in point number 1 and number 2, this really brought the lingo in, or I should say that the term model minority into American lingo. People started to really use this term around this time period because they kind of felt that it made sense. Why did it make sense? Well, as of the publication of this article, there was increasingly a racially divisive politics that started to influence America's way of thinking about race and race relations. And a big part of it is the rise of civil rights movement that started, well, there are various reasons to think that civil rights movement started much earlier than 1950s, but oftentimes that's where historians kind of see the start of the civil rights movement as we know it today. So in 1950s, there are much more civil rights that were being claimed by people of color, especially African Americans, but also Asian Americans and Latinx Americans, and also Indigenous Americans, Native Americans as well. And so given that kind of rise of civil rights movement, there was an increasing notion that America has to do something about racialized minorities. They can't just continue with the status quo. And part of the response that kind of really was based on the awareness that there is a need for a change in racial relations was to say, oh, there are successful minorities versus problem minorities. Successful minorities such as Asian Americans, and not so successful problem minorities such as Black Americans. And in this way, it really drove a wedge between different groups of marginalized people of color. For instance, as you see in this slide to the left side, the quote from this article, Japanese Americans, a Model Minority, states, Generally, this kind of treatment creates what might be termed problem minority, meaning this kind of treatment, such as the incarceration of you and your entire community without due cause and due processes. So William Peterson is definitely using the historical precedents of Japanese American incarceration during World War II that I mentioned earlier. So this kind of treatment usually creates problem minority who are bitter about what their government did, critical, angry, those kinds of negativity associated with their social image. And that kind of leads to the reality of slum life, the article's author mentions. When whites defined Negroes, I am using the quotation here when I use the word, as inherently less intelligent and furnished them with inferior schools, the products of these schools, meaning graduates of those schools, often validated the original stereotype that they are a problem minority. So it's really using Japanese American as a model minority, as an image, as a successful minority, as a way to criticize Black Americans who apparently, in the author's opinions, were not doing as good as Japanese Americans, right? So what does it do to the relationship between Black Americans and Asian Americans? They were kind of pitted against each other, right? So that's the reason why I said earlier that this kind of narrative really drove wedge in between different groups of marginalized individuals in America. So those are three reasons or historical origins of the model minority myth, which I hope kind of made you realize that this is a problematic myth that probably shouldn't be perpetuated. And yet it did go on, it did persist. So Asian Americans in STEM, the model minority, so I am sort of playing with the article here by, instead of saying a model minority, I'm saying the model minority because Asian Americans in STEM disciplines seems to actually embody this historically misled notion, misguided notion of model minority, because of many successes, very highly visible successes that they seem to accomplish in the latter half of the 20th century and onward, including today. So I'm just using Professor Chanlin Tian's example here, and the biography of him that is actually taken from the UC Berkeley website. He was obviously a professor and the chancellor of the university, one of the most admired, regarded university in the US. And you can see how he really started out as a very struggling immigrant who really didn't have much assets, only to see rapidly his life becoming successful, right? So he arrived as essentially a refugee and penniless in 1956, but by 1957 he is earning degrees in Princeton University, and 2 years later he successfully completes the degrees, and then UC Berkeley hires him in the same year, and then he got rapidly promoted, and he now occupies a very important place in the university system as a university administrator. So this kind of images of Asian Americans, especially East Asian Americans, as embodiment, a symbol of model minority, seems to actually perpetuate the myth, when myth is obviously, again, based on misguided historical perceptions about Asian Americans. So what's wrong with that image? I really like to impress upon you that there are actual harms being done because the image persists. So I'd like to give you 3 reasons why this model minority myth is wrong. So first of all, the image does not accurately capture all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as they are incredibly diverse group. So Asian Americans, as we refer to them, or AAPIs, or Asian American Pacific Islanders, or APIDAs, there are, again, various ways of referring to us, really means that we are so diverse. So it's really hard even for us to come to agreement what term that we need to use to actually refer to ourselves. Asian Americans contain more than 40 national groups and even more ethnic groups, right? So for example, Hmong people is an ethnic group, but they don't have a nation. So it actually adds kind of complexity to the kind of diversity that Asian American embodies. I should also mention that there is also a class disparity. There are wide disparities, as you see in the second item, as a second item on the screen, in income, and also education levels and access to healthcare and basic social services as well. But I'm gonna just focus on income due to the time limit. So Asian American households had a median annual income of $85,800 in 2019, higher than the $61,800 among all US households. But only 2 groups out of 40, right, had household incomes that exceeded the median for Asian Americans, Indians, and Filipinos. And most of the other groups are well below the median, including the 2 with the lowest incomes, Burmese at a little more than $44,000, and Nepalese 55,000 as a median income. So when we think about APIDAs or AAPIs or Asian Americans, let's remember that we are really looking at a wide range of people with wide range of backgrounds, socioeconomic background included, and who are here for a wide range of different reasons. For instance, Vietnamese refugees who came to the United States after 1976 as so-called boat people, their background and the reason why they are here is vastly different from the Indian Americans who came here as a trained engineer with already degree in hand after 1965, right? So we can't really generalize Asian American as a model minority or anything else, as a matter of fact, because of this incredible diversity that exists among us. And second reason why it's wrong is that it drives a wedge into interracial alliance. As I mentioned earlier, there were many historical evidence that suggests that mainstream America was intentionally using this image of model minority to divide and conquer people of color. And this is something that I hope that you have been following, because students for fair admission versus Harvard and UNC is going to be heard by Supreme Court in this June. So this is going to be coming up, and many people worry that given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, they are likely to strike down the affirmative action that has long worked as an excellent way of making institutions of higher education, including Michigan State University, and workplaces and any other public spaces more diverse, right? And misconception here that I like you to, even as like a single thing that I like you to take away from my talk today, but this is a misconception I like you to correct if you had such a misconception. The misconception here is that this is something that Asian Americans are wanting to do, to strike down Supreme Court, strike down the affirmative action so that they can have better chance of being accepted to good universities, such as Harvard or University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. It is not led by Asian Americans. The movement to strike down the Supreme Court case is led by Edward Blum that you see on the left side of the screen here, a long-term affirmative action critic. There are no Asian Americans in those cases, Supreme Court cases, that actually support the elimination of affirmative action. As you can see from this APIA vote, APIDA, you can see on average, 69% of Asian Americans support affirmative action. And just to give you a sense of how it fits into the picture of other groups, about 57 white Americans support affirmative action. I think it was about 67% of Latinx Americans who support the affirmative action. So it's about the same as Asian Americans who support the affirmative action. And about 72% of African Americans, Black Americans who support affirmative actions. So I think it's fair to say predominantly large majority of Asian Americans do support affirmative actions. So I like you to kind of keep it in your mind when we see attacks on affirmative actions that some argues this benefit Asian American students and families. It's not something that was supported by Asian Americans. And the third reason why it's wrong, the myth is wrong, is that the image does not protect AAPI people from discrimination and persecution. So you might think of the anti-Asian and Asian American hate that really started to catch attention in Americans' public after start of the global pandemic in March 2020. But there are actually historical precedents to that. This is not something that just happened 3 years ago. Here you are seeing an image of Dr. Wenho Lee, a Taiwanese American scientist at the University of California, the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, who was wrongly charged of stealing nuclear secret from the laboratory and sent it to the People's Republic of China in 1999. And there was no reason why he was charged, and there was no reason why he was, on top of that, incarcerated and stayed incarcerated for as long as 9 months because there was no evidence other than kind of circumstantial evidence of how, oh, he was talking to in a very collegial way when Los Alamos National Laboratory invited Chinese nuclear physicists and sort of exchange ideas about their research about nuclear weapons. And by the way, this is something that, happens all the time in any intellectual inquiries, right? Including STEM disciplines, you communicate and collaborate internationally or nationally with others to advance your knowledge. So when Lee was doing just what scientists usually do in their work, it was seen as a reason to suspect him, right? And one of the reasons why he was being a suspect, and not to mention he was charged and he was incarcerated, was that he was speaking in Chinese language when he was communicating with his Chinese colleagues. That contributed to the authorities' suspicion that there was some kind of secret that was being communicated when others who were not able to understand or speak Chinese language were not able to decipher what's being discussed. So this really goes to show you how, model minority myth is not really something that protects Asian Americans or AAPI people from discrimination or persecution. And this has been happening in various ways. It's not something that affects scientists only, but the people whom scientists aspire to serve. Here I am taking an example of medical science. So I am looking at HIV/AIDS. This is something that I do as a historian. I look at historical dynamisms so that we can better contextualize what's happening in today's society, right? So I'm looking at the HIV/AIDS pandemic in its second decade in 1993. And here you see a Japanese-American gay man, Mr. Glenn Itsutsu, being featured by Daily News in New York in the year of 1993, saying that there's nothing out there for people of Asian ethnic background with HIV/AIDS that they can go to as a social resource, or even the medical clinic that would be able to really take good care of Asian American patients who are HIV/AIDS positive. And the reason for that lack of care for Asian Americans is that, so again, this is a quote from the same article, when it comes to AIDS, the Asian community would much rather focus on someone who is every mother's dream. Yang Kan-cho, a medical student who last week found a way to kill the HIV virus in a test tube. When someone dies in Chinatown, in contrast, again, this is New York's Chinatown, right? They don't call it AIDS. AIDS is mostly with the whites and the black. So many things are encapsulated in this quotation. So let me just quickly go over some of them at least. So here you see the damage that can be done by the model minority myth, right? So in the celebration of somebody who works in science, medical science in this case, who made a great discovery that may lead to the cure of HIV/AIDS, in the shadow of that, we lose the sight of Asian Americans who are suffering from the disease, right? So that's one way in which model minority myths can actually damage the community of Asian Americans. And also you can see how HIV/AIDS is mostly with the white and the black issue. And that's how, this kind of simplistic view of how certain ethnic or racialized groups they suffer from the high rate of certain disease can actually make other people who are also suffering from the same disease very invisible and hard to reach out to. And maybe that causes a delay in treatment, and it probably kind of reduce the quality of care for them. Again, all of this contributing to the low rate of Asian American HIV patient to be able to have an access to medical care that they need, or even diagnosis that they need to have to start a treatment. And also there are various different ways. I'm gonna use another example that's more recent. So this is in the COVID-19 era. And so one fact that I like to share to again illuminate the damage that can be done by the model minority myth is that Filipino and Filipino American nurses are hit by an extremely high rate of COVID-related death. They make up just 4% of registered nurses in the United States. However, they account for over 26% of all COVID-related death among registered nurses. So we have to know why, right? So if there is such a disparity, we have to know why. And then it's in the same way that we know that all too well, too painfully and plainly, that African Americans suffer disproportionately high rate of infection by HIV, by coronavirus, excuse me. And so we know that there is a certain kind of social inequality and inequity that accounts for that. Same thing applies to Filipino American nurses. If they are only 4% in terms of their population, but account for more than 1 in every 4 COVID-related deaths, then there must be structural issues that explain that disparity. And historian Catherine Ceniza Choi, in her book, Empire of Care, Nursing and Migration in Filipino American History, explained the reason like this. This disparity has origins in not only their immigration status, but also the US colonial policy of benevolent assimilation that supported US-style nursing education and the US post-colonial policies of recruiting cheap immigrant labor to fill the labor force gap in nursing, especially in the most dangerous critical and/or bedside care. So let me unpack a little bit. So this kind of gap that you see in the first item on your screen can be explained by various things. First of all, they had a colonial policy. America colonized the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. And that continued, colonization continued until America granted the Philippines independence in 1946 after World War II. So during the colonial period that went on for about half a century, US used the so-called benevolent assimilation policy that essentially imposed US-style nursing education in the Philippines, including English education, meaning that language of instruction in those nursing education schools in Philippines in US colonial era, it was in English. So it was something that really became deeply ingrained in the professional education in nursing in the Philippines because of that policy. And the US was thinking that this is a way to sort of make people of Philippines more assimilated to the United States. And this is something that was done with good intentions, right? Benevolent part speaks to America's good intentions of forced assimilation, in fact. And the US post-colonial policies after 1946 started to change that policy, except that the kind of flow of immigrant in and out from Philippines in relationship to the US didn't really change that much. Actually, it even intensified after the United States went through the civil rights movement era, and also the civil rights movement era was the era for women's movement, right? And many women who occupied previously nursing positions in the United States were pursuing other professional opportunities that they probably liked better than nursing profession. And to fill the gap that was created by kind of the change in the labor force, US started to recruit immigrant labor in nursing, especially aggressively from the Philippines. And that's the reason why there are so many nurses from the Philippines and US to start with. And then because of their visa status that makes them vulnerable, they are oftentimes stationed in the most dangerous critical bedside care. That kind of explains the reason why there is a gap. So to conclude, I'd like to give you a couple of observations that hope that kind of tie things together that I have been discussing so far. First conclusion, the notion of Asian Americans in STEM as the model minority does great harm to Asian Americans, including scientists in STEM disciplines themselves, and allows white supremacists to divide and conquer racialized minorities in the United States. Both in history and in contemporaneous context, it's very clear that the model minority myth is really doing a harm to all of us. It doesn't protect us from violence or prejudices, and it actually does harm to people who are made invisible because of the sort of hyper visibility of successful Asian American scientists in STEM disciplines in particular. And second of all, I like to conclude awareness in education and outreach are urgently needed for alliance building. So when I say alliance building, I don't mean just alliance building among people of color or marginalized population or women or LGBTQ plus A plus individuals. We are really thinking about alliance building, including all people who would like to increase the awareness that the model minority is no more. Model minority cannot be anymore. And it doesn't actually include only interracial or interethnic alliances. I think Asian Americans and others who are willing to sort of contribute this kind of education and outreach doing the intra-racial education and the relationship building. For instance, Asian Americans are fast growing, right? I'm sure many of you, including myself, are not born and raised here. So we are relatively recent immigrants in the scheme of things. Recent immigrants may not have been exposed to race education that many born American Asian Americans are familiar with, and may be unaware of the danger of the model minority myth that I laid out in today's talk. So there are within the community and across the community kind of education that we need to be doing And my hope is that, especially because Asian American in STEM disciplines are kind of put on the pedestals, right, as the model minority, there are certain kind of urgency that comes with people in that position to take action, contribute to awareness, education, and outreach, so that there could be a better alliance that would allow us to fight more efficiently and effectively against the model minority myth that doesn't really do doesn't give anybody any benefit except for people who are trying to divide and conquer, people who like to have equality and fairness. So with that said, I'm gonna stop here, and I'm hoping that I have left enough time for Q&As.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Welken, for an excellent and very, very educational talk. I'm here to address any questions any of our attendees has. If you would like to write your questions on Q&A, or I think that's perhaps the best way to do it. And as we are waiting for new questions, I'm gonna start with one. So this whole idea of model versus problem minority that was clearly cultivated by the government in the 50s and the 60s, right? Has it led to fights and bad relationships between the different minority groups? And are there any historic examples of that?
Yeah, so I think one way to think about this consequence of the model minority myth that was really promoted by, of course, US government, but media and politicians as well, among other things. One consequence is that there was actually increasing awareness among marginalized population to build even stronger alliances. So before I answer your question, I'd like to really emphasize that, because civil rights movement, as it's being taught in the US history, kind of tend to emphasize how they were sort of, there was a one version for Black Americans, there was a one version for Indigenous Americans, and it kind of gives a impression of siloed civil rights movement. But if you look at Black civil rights movement, there was a much alliance building that was ongoing with all marginalized, racially marginalized populations. If you look at Asian American civil rights movement, you see Black Americans and white Americans and Indigenous Americans and Latina Americans contributing to Asian American struggle. So I really like to emphasize that to actually counter that. We kind of tend to think that, oh, this must have really divided all people of color. And that's actually kind of the image that some white supremacist wants us to believe. So for that reason, I like to put it out there. So I can think of one example of, however, unfortunate example of how sort of interracial tension came to bubble up to the surface. So when there was a Los Angeles riot that really originated from the Rodney King beating and violence done by the LA Police Department officers against African American individual who were speeding in a car for whatever reasons, and he was arrested, and in the process of the arrest, he was beaten very harshly, and the police officers were acquitted, and they were not found guilty. And in the subsequent days, there was a riot that were actually not exclusively participated by Black Los Angeles, but people who are from various backgrounds. But the narrative went, or media report went like this. So the rioters largely attacked Korean business owners in Los Angeles' Koreatown because they were jealous of their success. Again, they were Black Americans are sort of presented as a problem minority, and the Korean Americans are presented as successful model minority. right? And therefore, the kind of interracial animosity contributed to this kind of targeted attack. So there are so many historical inaccuracies to this media representation of the racial violence, racialized violence. So I don't really have a time to go into that, but I think this is something that was reported as one great example of how model minority actually may have been seen as real. And then, so that's the reason why actually it's all the more important for people of color themselves to be aware this is not real. This is so misguiding and misleading, because we could be tricked into believing such a notion that, oh yeah, so we actually hate each other, right? Well, it's very problematic to think that way.
So there is a question, kind of a follow-up. What is the best method to break hold of a supremacist hold on the model minority myth? Conversation, articles, projects, what method?
Yeah, so I wish I know the really great answer to that. So I can only mention work in progress kind of answers to that question. But thank you for asking. I'm glad that you are thinking about how to act. I think, you know, we can talk about programs all day, but we also like to have action plans. And one thing that I think is important is start your conversation with your families. You know, we often talk about, you know, our aging parents or this uncle or aunt that are very difficult in terms of how they express their political views. Start a difficult conversation, and you can do that in a way that's most comfortable to you. It's better than not starting a conversation. I say that because of the last thing that I mentioned during my talk, that there are certain kind of generational gap that we see in Asian American communities. Oftentimes, people who are newer to American society don't see racial politics. And so therefore, education is very important. So let's start from our own personal, intimate lives. That's one way to think about that. In a larger scheme of things, let's say, how can we actually counter the model minority myth at MSU, or maybe even larger society in Midwest? I think it's important to use all kinds of social media available, because oftentimes that's where people make connections and gain information. So let's make sure that we are sending our messages through all venues, all information dissemination routes. And I think, frankly, it's important for us to actually support the community, the people who are working hard to actually engage with that kind of awareness, educational activities, to actually say that, you know, we see you, we know that you are there, and that we know that you are doing the work. So Asian American APIDA Heritage Month was not really officially celebrated at MSU for a long time. Why are we celebrating that, you know, in the last 2-3 years? Well, it's kind of the reason. The reason is because, you know, there was a heightened hatred expressed against Asian and Asian Americans. So even though we always celebrated APIDA Heritage Month at MSU, within our community, at Asian American community, it wasn't widely known. And so now we know a little bit more about what APIDA Heritage Month is all about. It's your opportunity to get to know people who are organizing those efforts and then trying to sort of do your part in supporting them. So that's one thing or another thing that is hopefully concrete enough for you to do.
So I know we ran out of time, but there are 2 good questions in the Q&A, and if Dr. Walker is willing for us to stay a few more minutes, if somebody needs to leave, we understand. So there's a question here. As of March 2023, State Senate approved a bill banning Chinese citizens from buying or controlling property in South Carolina, after ensuring that companies already doing business here can expand in the future. And the attendee says, I was very concerned that more and more states will target Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, in the future. Is there anything we can do to cope with the current situation?
Yeah, so it is a really difficult time to be a Chinese immigrant or Chinese Americans in the United States. I first of all want to recognize that. it's not the first time that Chinese Americans in particular experience this type of marginalization, and that has political, reasons behind it. So I like to say that this is not easy at all. And I actually finished teaching US foreign relations class, and I started my class of a discussion of anti-Asian, especially anti-Chinese sentiment that has been on rise, and concluded that just yesterday with former President Donald Trump's comment about China virus. So this is something that that we should recognize more. I'm not a trade expert, so I can't comment on those specifics, but I like to say that just thinking about Wen Holi's case, the nuclear, the Taiwanese American mathematician who was wrongly persecuted and incarcerated in 1999 and onward. I like to say that in his case, it was very important to bring the awareness to the allies, right? So there are people who came in support of him. Think about Committee of 100 Chinese American group that is very powerful in America. They issue statistical information, and I think in collaboration with Columbia University, they are just about ready to release the study that they conducted in recent years, I think titled "The Status of Chinese Americans in the United States." So, engage with those facts and see if you can be part of that support network. Because again, when irrational persecution of targeted racial groups in the United States became really evident, it's very important we have a grassroots network that can come in your support and stand by you. So that's one way to think about how to sort of counter that kind of increase suspicions, increase regulation that are hostile to chosen country.
And the last question is about affirmative action. How do we attempt to educate minorities about the impact that affirmative action has had on education? And what do we do if this is reversed by the Supreme Court?
Yes, another very important and big question that's difficult to answer. So I will definitely repeat my comment about the importance of creating and being part of grassroots organizations and be part of the community and talk with your friend, with your family about how they feel about it. And then this is actually not just talking, it's actually the process of empowerment, right? And then sort of think about strategies that may be a small step, like talking to each other, but also it could be something that leads to running for local office. I would definitely encourage people who are aware of those issues more than others to consider running for political offices and pay attention to what Michigan legislature is doing locally. You can start from there. There are many initiatives that are happening at this moment that are related to Asian American community, including, I think, one bill that, let me try to be accurate here. Michigan House of Representatives plans to consider a bill that would make Chinese Lunar Year a statewide recognized perpetual holiday. So it's not obviously just about celebration, right? So there are obviously things that are political and social and cultural that are very much deeply tied with this kind of registration. So kind of pay attention to what's going on in local politics and then think about, how you can sort of capitalize or augment those kinds of efforts that are actually taking place. And if the Supreme Court comes down to the wrong side, I will just go ahead and make my position clear here of the history by striking down affirmative action. Think about, ways in which you might contribute as to the groundwork that could work as a counterforce. So, in the US politics, oftentimes, what happened to the Roe v. Wade case, right? The massive response took place among women's group, not just women's group, but across the board, right? And then we are at the state level very much pushing back against it. Michigan is one of the states that successfully has been pushing back against that. So think about the next step rather than thinking that, oh, this is the end of diversity. It's not going to be the end of diversity if, as long as you are keep on talking and paying attention.